Good morning. Matt Nyman here, and I've spent some time the last day or so thinking about our work of last Wednesday and specifically how we tried to summarize aspects of our readings through the gallery walk and then through the discussion that followed, which was very rich. What I wanted to do was try to capture some of that and to summarize it so that we can make clear connections between what we're reading about in theory, not in theory, but the theory that we're reading, and how it applies to our practices in the classroom. Because that is vital for things like EdTPA, but it's also vital for us to make justifications about why we're doing certain tasks in our practice. So I hope this is valuable. It was valuable for me as it allowed me to start exploring these connections in a little more detail. This text or this audio was not recorded from a script, so there might be some hesitation as I move through this, but let's move ahead. One of the first items that came out, not first, but one of the items that came out of discussion was the connections between practice and theory and how we can help mitigate those so that they are balanced. Because teaching is a very personal endeavor, but it also must be informed by the literature and by things we know about how people learn. So there's a balance between theory and personal beliefs and the wisdom of practice. So I think it's important that we keep those things in mind. One of the things that confounds this is, as Marie pointed out, that the teacher is frequently faced with lots of implementations and re-implementations and new fads, and so that can be frustrating. But there is good stuff out there that will help practice, and so we need to be mindful of that as well. In reviewing the work that you did in class, the following theoretical concepts for teaching and learning came out of our summary sheets, and it will be valuable and important for you to have a grasp on these. I think that during your oral final, it's fair to ask you to reflect upon these ideas and how they apply to your practice. I'm not going to go through each one of these individually, but you should have a firm grasp of what each of these constructs are. But what I will talk about is how these apply to our framework of high leverage practices, and then on how they apply to our work with EdTPA. So let's move on to that. Here's a list of the high leverage practices, and my goal here is to try to work towards connecting these practices to the ideas in theory that support why we do these things. One item I would like to add, and maybe this is above and beyond, but I added to high leverage practice number 6 that we make sense of students' prior knowledge to inform our instruction. So that's our ideas about constructivism, and if we extend this to their cultural and ethnic background, that's that whole idea about, in their communities, that's the whole idea about funds of knowledge, which you'll be learning about. Many of the important learning theories emphasize that we need to know what students know already before we position them to become more competent learners. As I looked over these practices, I wanted to develop some sort of organization because lists to me don't really reflect the true power of these practices, and I needed a more visual for for sort of digesting these and connecting them. And so this is my own construct, but what I did is shown on the next slide. Okay, we kind of moved slowly into that. So it occurred to me that high leverage practice 7, positioning students as competent, is really kind of the fundamental goal of our practice. And the other practices I separated into planning here and teaching. And then there are some practices which incorporate both teaching and planning. So this is a mat-centric organization, and I just found it useful when thinking about how this part, our theory work, connects with our high leverage practices. So let's look at those connections. So that was a nice slow fade. The new aspect of this slide is adding this text and connecting it to adaptive expertise. So in thinking about these high leverage practices and our theoretical ideas down here about learning, it occurred to me that adaptive expertise of all of these for the teacher is realized through time. So one of the truisms of practice is that it takes time to become an expert. And so over time you will develop more efficiency with these high-level practices, and also develop ways to innovate around them so that you feel they work better towards positioning students as competent. So right away, this construct of adaptive expertise is useful because it helps us frame our own growth as teachers. It takes time, it takes becoming efficient, and it takes time to be innovative so that you establish that true identity of yourself as a teacher. That was a little quicker. So one of the ways I started thinking about this is that positioning students as competent, basically, or one part of it means that we encourage students to use metacognition, so we're very explicit about teaching those skills. We want competent students to develop a growth mindset for thinking that they can become competent. And finally, at least in these constructs that we identified, that competent students become an adaptive expert in terms of understanding or innovating, as well as having great efficiency in their learning, both within a certain context, but also as a skilled consumer of knowledge and abilities. So in my perspective, this is one way that the high leverage practices connects with theory. So let's further investigate this. Another construct or theory that we talked about is this zone of proximal development, which is the idea that we want to place students in a place where they are learning, that the learning's not too easy, but that the step to the next level of learning is enhanced by working with someone else or working with a knowledgeable expert, so that they are challenged. And the term scaffold has been applied to this idea about the zone of proximal development, not by Vygotsky, but by another person whose name I forgot. But it's around scaffolding. That's kind of a more general term for it. And this zone of proximal development, as I see it, applies to teaching towards a goal, maintaining a productive and learning environment. We don't want it to be too hard or too easy, and then making sure that students, as I read this, orienting students to one another and to the discipline can be looked at as in terms of facilitating a community in the class, so that students are learning as part of the classroom experience from each other. So this diagram shows the whole enchilada with all of the connections, and I'm emphasizing again that these are things that I thought about and that came out of some of our discussion, and I am trying to work towards connecting these ideas that you identified as important from your reading with the practices that are part of our program, so that we can see how these practices are built upon good ideas, good theories about how people learn. So that is kind of the messy diagram with all of the components. So I'm going to take all those lines off and move on to one last item. And once again, just to reiterate what was going on here is I am gathering information that you provided through your summaries and through our discussions. I'm adding a little bit of my own organization so that we see the connection between theory and high leverage practices, and that we also take into account that we need to acknowledge that theory is an important part of practice when combined with ideas about learning and the wisdom of practice. So my next step is to look at how this connects to our work with EdTPA. The diagram on the left shows the 3 tasks that you'll be going through for EdTPA: planning, instruction, and assessment, which all hovers around student learning. And I think there's some really cool parallels between this model and our organization over here. In fact, it's kind of parallel. That planning, obviously, is the same. Teaching and instructions are the same. And then there are these overlap areas which fall either in these categories. And student learning is high leverage practice, number 7, positioning students as competent. So what I hope this allows us to do is to use our model for high leverage practices, or our framework, when you're writing the prompts for EdTA, to support your decisions and justify your planning for instruction. And the ideas I've put forward in terms of how that is built upon certain theories, which I think is accurate, but open for discussion, will help you produce those statements of justification. And I think this is important for EdTPA, but I really think it's important even beyond to work on our voice as teachers, as competent educators, so that we can have a bigger role in what goes on in our classroom. And I think that's important. The following set of slides are the result of some conversations that Sue Ann and I had regarding our summary, and we came to the conclusion that there was one part that was missing in terms of the theory, and so I've added a few more slides to highlight that additional really important component that guides our practice. So here's our set of diagrams that hopefully summarize what we did last Wednesday. And moving into another slide, nice and slow, we added the additional ideas around social cultural theories of learning, and a paper that I just completed reading by somebody named Lemke, 2001, summarize social cultural theory or ideas as viewing science education, and research on science education as human social activities conducted within institutional and cultural frameworks. And you probably could have read that, but just to give you a chance to view this. So it's a pretty heavy area, but basically what it's saying is highlighted on the next slide. So if we break this down a little bit, if we unpack it, as we say, what the social cultural theory indicates about learning is that it's a social process that occurs through interactions between people and between groups of people, which makes sense. Some of the things you might do in classes like small group work or gallery walks or things like that, jigsaws are a social process. And so the learning is mitigated by those activities. And the other two parts are also rather large issues that institutions matter, like the type of school you go to and the types of decisions that are made in terms of what's to be learned matter about learning. And then culture influences, so where you're from, your ethnicity, your language use, and so forth, all influence the type of learning or the extent of learning or the success of learning. And this balloons very quickly into thinking about what are the types of factors that influence education, science research, access to these, entry into these fields, etc. So it's a really important component of what we do in the classroom. So it's really worth thinking about. And if you'd like to get some more information, that Lemke article is really interesting and very thoughtfully written, and I encourage you to read it. Maybe I'll put it on the Canvas site. So let's see, what's the next slide? Moving in slowly. Okay, this next slide just points out that the ideas that we talked about around the zone of proximal development are actually a social cultural idea that is to move to be within that zone. That's the area where the entry of a expert or a person that knows a little bit more about the learner will assist in that learning. So it's really socially assisting the learner that'll get them through that next zone of being able to understand the concepts. So this slide kind of brings the social cultural ideas or theory into the frameworks of looking at high leverage practices. And when you think about the importance of the social aspects of learning, you start to see a lot of connections with these high leverage practices, like knowing what students know or how they know it is important. Developing good environments of learning is vital to the social learning. Responding to student contributions requires us to know more about the individual students. And then orienting students to one another, obviously, is a social process. And so Sue-Ann pointed this out when we were putting this together. It's really, really important and something to really think about and to apply to our learning and our practice. And I think that's my last slide. So if it is, then I hope this is helpful and assist us in our thinking about our teaching and our practice. And if it isn't, I'll see you on the next slide.